himself. We're gonna have the Q&A for all three speakers. So if you guys have any questions for any of them, go ahead and ask. You know, ask away. If you guys are way in the back, we've got plenty of room up here. Go ahead and move up so you can hear better. Okay.
Guys want some water?
Sure. Please grab me the whole.
Some water.
All right. Who would like to open with the first question?
Mike,
Mike?
someone?
Oh, they're going to have to switch it back and forth if we use this. Why don't we just pass that?
Well, see a mic for the audience.
Oh.
Hello. My name is Prakash. I'm from India. Actually, I have a couple of questions. One is, we find that the application of urea tends to increase the pH. Unlike what you said, it keeps it neutral. We find it increasing. So if you have any comment on that. The second one is, how does we find that a negative pH tends to reduce the presence of fungus comes down when the pH is a little low. And the third one is, you said 1.65 to 2.16 kgs per 100 meter squared application of nitrogen. Just want to know the frequency. How often do you, is it every month, every twice a month, or every other month, or what?
Okay. So the first one with the urea, we tend to find it to be, now there might be a difference between sand-based and native soil, but at least on native soil, we tend to find that to be pretty pH neutral. We know that the urea itself is acidic. I'm really interested in why you see the pH would go up. I would think, if anything, it might bring it down a little bit, if anything. But the urea, for us, we commonly use that as our control. Now, honestly, if there's a lot of buffer, all the soils are different. So if there's a buffer system that goes on within a soil, or your starting pH is at a certain level, then it's very difficult to pick up what the impact is on the rhizosphere, or the rhizosphere pH. So what I'm talking about is when you put the ammonium down, where that exchange is going on is right at the root surface. So you can have that exchange, but you're not impacting the bulk soil pH. We really don't have a good way of measuring that rhizosphere pH and how long that change lasts. We know that it occurs, or otherwise the plant wouldn't be taking up the nitrogen when it's in the soil. But we don't know exactly how. Like, I can't tell you if we went out with a certain rate of ammonium sulfate that the rhizosphere pH change is going to be this, or that the soil pH change is going to be this for this amount of time. I talked too much on the first question. The second question is?
Second one is about the pH. If pH being negative, that is less than 6 or less than 6.5, will that bring the fungus down? Is it a deterrent to fungus growth? Or we find that if you keep it at less than 6.5, it's a definite deterrent to fungus growth. This is just from the field I'm talking.
Yeah, so we've done a little bit of work of putting the nitrogen within the growth media. And what's interesting is that particularly with an ammonium-based source, so what we talked about, what goes on with the roots, actually goes on with the fungus as well. The fungus uses nitrogen like a plant would, obviously at very much reduced rate. But the fungus actually changes the pH when it does the same thing too. So when we were increasing, this is all within the laboratory, but when we're increasing our ammonium rate in our Petri dish, and that's the only nitrogen source, then we're actually seeing the decrease in pH the same way that we would see within the soil. And the only thing that's in there that would be changing it is the pathogen. So that mycelium is growing across, and it's actually altering its environment too, the same way the plant root is, which is really fascinating. But we don't know exactly at what level. There's so many different soil-borne pathogens that I can't give you a number on what your soil pH would be to limit the growth. I would say, though, that you don't want to limit your nutrient availability. So you don't want to say, go down to 5, or God forbid, in the 4s, and then alter your nutrient availability. But that immediate impact that you get by putting the ammonium in and the rhizosphere pH, that's the kicker. Because that's when you're altering things and increasing the manganese availability and perhaps deterring the pathogen growth. And then the third one is
Application rates of nitrogen.
Yeah, so that's gonna vary based off of your, I kind of had it on a monthly schedule, particularly with the growth potential model, but I think that's a weather change type of thing. And I'm a big proponent of spoon feeding greens. I mean, that's going to be something different than you would be doing in the fairways and the tees. So it's hard to give an overall, okay, you need to be at 1.65 kilograms per hectare. It's kind of more of a guide, and I think that altering weather conditions should be telling you when you're going to need to be putting out different rates and what schedule. Bill, do you want to expound on that part of it?
No, you got it.
Okay. Because he's the major fertility guy. I'm just a pathologist.
Question about your pH. So you were at, what's the pH of your water and what's the pH of your soil?
Water pH should be around, we get refrigerated water, so it's around between 7.5 to 8.
Uh-huh.
So then by applying sulfate-based fertilizers, we tend to try to bring the pH down to about 6.5.
Okay.
And there we find that most of the funguses are kept at bay. Nobody comes. We don't go to 5, that's impossible.
Yeah.
But 6.5, 6 to 6.5, we don't get in these. I'm talking about all preventive. We rather not apply the fungicide by doing preventive measures. That's what I'm saying.
Well, I'm just thinking that you may be seeing the pH rise with urea, not from the urea itself. It's from the water being at a higher pH and the chemistry that you're introducing whenever you're using that water source, and you're not including an ammonium-based fertilizer that might cancel out some of that. So if you're seeing a rise, that rise is because you're losing the acidification effect. So if you fertilize with nothing, you'd still see that pH rise, likely because of the pH of the water being higher than the pH of your soil. And so you're kind of slowly bringing it up. So the water and the chemistry of that water really can have a big effect on the soil pH. So I would say that the urea is not raising the pH, it's just allowing the pH to kind of come up towards the pHs of the water.
Anybody else in the audience?
Getting the fungicides in the ground with fairy ring. I saw your figures, but it's not necessarily easy to get it in. Can you give us some best practices? How many minutes you run on an average head or anything like that? Because it's really difficult to get it into those areas, and it seems to be in a variety of areas. And I think I'm wasting my fungicide, like you talked about.
Okay. So the question, I guess I would ask you a question back. How much water are you putting out per minute? I think that it's important because I don't know the difference between, there's 3 different irrigation companies, big ones, that have different irrigation heads. So it's difficult to tell somebody how many minutes you should be putting on. This is where you need to bring out a coffee can and actually go and put the irrigation on for 10 minutes and get a ruler and see how many millimeters that is. That would be the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is that I watered in on my trials with a So it'd be 6 millimeters of irrigation immediately after application. And that is ponding up water underneath my feet. And I did not move it through. So the KOC, the amount of adhesion or connection between the fungicide and organic matter is huge. You're more than likely not going to move it down than move it all the way through. And we've seen that over and over and over again. Now, the green that I did my research on was 5 years old, so there was, obviously a little bit of organic matter there. A brand new green that doesn't have organic matter set up, you might move it through, but I still would err on the side of trying to overwater it towards a soil-borne pathogen than underwatering it. Yeah, so that's a great question. So he asked about the time. So we did another ancillary study looking at watering it immediately and watering it in 10 hours later, which would kind of replicate what a night irrigation system would be. We saw no difference in control. Now, that being said, when I had a superintendent that would call me angrily and I could almost feel his red face through the phone, is when he didn't irrigate it in. Now, there's some other studies that say perhaps you don't need to irrigate some of these in, and I would definitely look at that with an air of caution. If you're going after something soil-borne, 3 millimeters is what I would consider would be the minimum that I would put on. So this is like the little devil on my shoulder here. Yes. So I often get the question about aerifying before or after. I think that aerification prior in a curative situation might be okay. I don't think preventatively you would want to put the aerification on first. And the reason I say that is that you don't want preferential flow. So particularly if your spacing is a little too wide, then the water is going to go where the hole is. And I would prefer to see it in a more uniform distribution pattern, which would be basically applying it and then watering it in and having it go down and then aerifying afterwards.
In a needle tine situation or in a quarter-inch tine, half-inch tine, what do you, aerification?
As far as aerification, I mean, I would go as big a tine as you could. Most of the time though, you're under a stressful situation, so quarter-inch tine, I mean, some will even solid tine, depending on the amount of play and whether. I would prefer to remove the core for sure and do a pure core aerification. Half inch is, well, we're off of metric system again. Thanks for baiting me. But I would go with as big a tine as you can get away with.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we've got another question, a few questions here I've got from the audience. This might be an easier one for you. What is the benefit of preventive actions regarding disease control?
So particularly the one thing I don't want to get across is that you would go out and spray a bunch of fungicides or pesticides without knowing your site history and without knowing that you have a problem with the disease. So there is an aspect here where, I don't want you to go out and spray everything for fairy ring if you've never had it on the property for the last 30 years. However, if you do have the problem, and you'll know, or of Bermuda grass decline or fairy ring or something else that's soil-borne, going preventatively is extremely important. Particularly where we're talking about Bermuda grass decline, the infection occurs well before you see symptoms. So you want to apply fungicides around the biology of that pathogen, not the oh crap moment when you actually have your symptoms, because at that point you're already behind and you're going to have to make many more curative applications to get that turf grass back to where you need it to be. The other aspect is particularly with soil-borne pathogens, we're also talking about something is wrong with the soil properties. So you don't want to have that water repellency or that hydrophobicity set up. You don't want to have too wet of a soil where you might have Pythium issues or black layer issues or any of those other issues that are attributed with that. Now, foliar, you might wait until an early curative depending on the budget, but if you always know that, you know, dollar spot is going to hit my seashore paspalum at this point, or you can integrate things like the Smith-Kearns model that's coming in through the Greenkeeper app. You know, those are things that you might want to look at in an early preventative application, particularly what I showed even with my watered-in applications, provided really good, you know, season-long reduction in a foliar disease, which was really surprising to me.
Lee,
Yes.
I'm pretty sure the recommendation for Bermuda decline in the USA is to, you know, if you've had an issue, you still have an issue, even though you've treated the symptoms. You've got to, its recommendation is to make 2 applications of an appropriate fungicide just before the Bermuda goes dormant. Now I realize that here we don't deal with dormancy, and the climate in the subtropics really kind of presents it messes up the life cycle on these. Well, I can't say it messes them up, but the life cycle are not textbook in the subtropics.
Now, is it the life cycle or is it the
Well, to me,
post
it's
cycle? Because the Bermuda grass might be outgrowing when the amount of pathogen that you have there.
Yes,
Sorry,
I agree, but
Yeah.
I agree with that, but I also do think it affects the life cycle. You mentioned earlier you felt that the damaging expansion below the soil, where the disease is growing on the roots and weakening the roots, is taking place probably in the dry season. And then when we get the rains over here and the lack of light, you start to stress the grass, and the physical symptoms on the surface begin to manifest. At least that's what I think I see. You mentioned you thought that the disease was active probably more in the dry
I think it's
period.
I don't know that I necessarily go along with it being more active in the dry period. Most of our soil-borne diseases do need a fair amount of soil moisture. Now, we artificially put that on,
Well,
so
dry,
it doesn't really...
dry does not mean no rain here.
Yeah.
We still get rain.
Yeah. So I think that you see symptoms when the most stress is on the plant. And the most stress is on the plant when you have no sunlight and you're having rain every day.
We agree with that. One thing I
Yeah.
might suggest, and you alluded to it with your application rates, the labels we see in East Asia are very short and sweet, and as you pointed out, they're applied to, derivation of the ag labels. I think people are well advised to go to the labels in the USA or in Europe, where they are extensive and even cover things like when you water in.
I agree. You know, when it comes to labels for agricultural products, they're pretty cut and dry. They're not talking about watering in, or because for agriculture related, you might apply a fungicide once, particularly if you're going to go ahead and harvest that plant. But you are correct. I mean, getting a label from Europe or the United States and reading through it will give you a bevy of information. You know, the reason I was able to put a couple Thai words up here was Google Translate. It was not my skills in Thai by any means. So if you can get to one of those and copy and paste directly off a PDF and just put it into Google Translate and see what it gets you. I sound like I've used Google Earth, Google Maps, and Google Translate in my presentation. I sound like I should be working for Google. But it's one way, hopefully, that maybe you can get a little bit more information. And then even with Dr. Vincelli's and Dr. Clark's great publication, too. You know, you're not going to, unfortunately, find that in Thai and Myanmar and Laos and all the different languages, and Chinese and Korean. But hopefully you'll be able to copy and paste off of that and get some information that you need.
Next, please.
Yes, Micah.
I have a question about taking a wet paper towel and a possibly disease sample or a certainly disease sample and putting it in a humid container and letting it grow. Are there certain temperatures that so should I put that at room temperature, put it in the oven, put it in the refrigerator? And how about light? Should I put it in the dark or put it in light, or should I put it in shade?
Good question. So with the incubation chambers that I was talking about, where you put the wet paper towel in with either in a plastic bag along with the cup cutter sample or into a Tupperware container, we commonly do that at room temperature. The heat will come from the plug itself. You don't want to put it in direct sunlight. You don't want to put it in the refrigerator. You don't want to leave it in your car on a hot day, because it's basically going to fry. Now, the temperature within that will get hotter than the ambient temperature, the 20 or 23 degrees C that you have it in whatever building you're in, because you're going to have microbial activity, and it's kind of surprising. I mean, you commonly will you can feel the soil and feel the heat coming of the microbes that are working in there. I would not put it on a windowsill in direct light. That's not needed. Many of these fungi, particularly the foliar diseases, will grow at night, and that's when the infection period takes place and when most of the expansion takes place, so they have no problem growing in the dark.
So I could put it at room temperature and not on the windowsill.
Yes, that is
like
correct.
On a table in the corner, and then come back and check it the next day.
Yeah, 24 to 48 hours is normally what I would say. And then fairy ring, you know, if you're concerned about that, then that might take another day or two. So 24 to 72 hours. Sometimes you can see a little bit of turf loss within those plugs too, like particularly the first slide I had. I mean, you can see where the turf is actually, because you're stressing out the turf grass too by not letting it have the direct sunlight, and sometimes that can give you a clue as to, particularly if there's a foliar disease that's working there. Now, I will say that if you do ship it off to the U.S., do not do that. Or if you ship it to any turf grass diagnostic lab, we want to be the one to do that, because particularly if you were to ship it somewhere and if it takes a day or 2 days, basically you've started that party before we want to, because basically all the fungi will start going nuts within that. And in particular, you don't know how it's getting shipped there either, so it could be in a 35 degrees C environment, and then all of a sudden you've got it all in a bag. So wrap the bottom in aluminum foil, leave the foliage exposed, and then securely pack it with newspaper or some other packing material, and then let us do the work when we get it.
Are you happy to receive plant disease samples from overseas?
I do not have an international permit, so I would not be able to do that, but I'm thinking about, the problem is that I don't have a turf grass diagnostic lab, I have me. So I look at all the samples that come in. I don't have anybody that I've trained yet to do that. So I would suggest, I'm not sure if North Carolina State has an international permit. I know University of Florida does. Phil Harmon would be very good, and he has a very similar climate and would have similar experience with warm season turf grasses. So I would probably point you that way, or also to Maria Thomas O. Peterson at Mississippi State University. At Riverside? Who's the...
Do they have a plant pathologist?
Do they have a turf grass? No. No. University of Florida or Mississippi State would be the two ways that I would go.
Okay, next question is, what is made of action of Cyazofamid?
What is the mode of action of Cyazofamid?
Right there.
Off the top of my head, I can't think of what it is, but it is a Pythium fungicide. So you would only be using that fungicide if you were targeting Pythium root rot or Pythium blight. So the mode of action is something that's novel. It's not similar to any of the other Pythium fungicides that are out there.
Okay, the next is how to prevent disease resistance to fungicides.
Okay, so very good question. How do you prevent fungicide resistance? So we have to realize that when we're applying a fungicide or any pesticide, we are acting as a selector for resistant individuals. And what that means is that within that population, we have a diverse array of different genetic backgrounds. And what we're doing is we're selecting for the resistant individuals that are already in the population. So we are not altering or mutating DNA. What we basically are doing is we're trying to control 1 million individuals, and perhaps 1% of those have a gene that allows them to be resistant to whatever pesticide we're putting out. So in saying that, that means that we have a finite number of applications of that fungicide or pesticide that we can make to that population and get control. So by alternating chemistries, what we end up doing is, you know, if I was going to be in a prize fight and do Muay Thai boxing, which I would never do, I wouldn't want to just throw punches. I'd want to throw punches and kicks and have a variety of ways of attacking the pathogen. So alternating fungicides, and in particular alternating fungicide classes, is very important. So you cannot use propiconazole, triademifon, tebuconazole, tridaconazole, propiconazole, triademifon in 7 consecutive sprays. Those would all be DMI fungicides, and you would not be rotating or alternating chemistries. Well, you'd be alternating chemistry, but not classes. The same thing goes for the strobilurin fungicides. So you cannot alternate azoxystrobin and pyraclostrobin back and forth, because you'll develop QOI resistance. Now, the good news is that many of our turfgrass pathogens, we have not found field resistance or field fungicide resistance. So dollar spot is one, and Pythium is one, and I would say we just don't know enough about a lot of the soil-borne pathogens to know if we're selecting for resistance for those or not. So there is a pathogen component to this story as well. We've applied fungicides for brown patch control since the beginning of turfgrass management, and we've done that over and over and over again, but we have not evolved any fungicide resistance. So it's important to know that particularly the ones that I pointed out, dollar spot, Pythium, if you're up a little farther up north and growing bentgrass or Poania, anthracnose is another one that will develop resistance. So knowing both that pathogen side and the fungicide part is important. And then last but not least, use your integrated disease management strategies to put less fungicide out. That's a pretty easy way of getting around fungicide resistance.
Anybody else in the audience? We got one more here from the audience here. Regarding fairy rings, what is the minimum and maximum amount of applications you should apply fungicides?
If you have an issue on your course and you have not tried to go preventatively, I would stress that. I would strive to know the history from, say, the prior history. You know that your fairy ring occurs in May. I would go with a 2 DMI application strategy, and then if it does come back out, I would try to manage it curatively. So you've got 2 applications that again are at least the United States rate, that half rate of fungicide. So I would attempt that first and see if you can get long-term control, and then if not, you would have to come back and, at least for fungicides, go with either flutalonyl or azoxystrobin or pyraclostrobin to try and manage it curatively. So what we're hoping is that the 2 application strategy would get you around, again, this is all dependent on climate, but at least get you around having to make 4, 5, 6, 7 applications, and in particular get you to using less fungicides.
Anybody else from the audience? for any of the three speakers, Andrew, Bill, or Lee? Okay, got some more here.
Kapkon Kruk.
1 second. We got some more.
Oh.
Hold on.
Not yet.
Okay, while we're waiting, I've got another one. There was a question you answered about resistance to fungicides. What about herbicides?
The same kind of strategies apply, the same premises. So you want to rotate your chemistries if at all possible. So you would want to rotate your PPOs with your ALS inhibitors, with your, particularly if you can try to go non-selective and spot apply either glyphosate or something else that's a non-selective herbicide. That would be one way to try and get at the herbicide resistance issue. Of course, now there are some, particularly goosegrass, which is resistant to glyphosate. So again, alternating those chemistries and thinking about can you integrate pre-emergent herbicides into your system to try and get at some of those herbicide-resistant weeds. So again, it's rotating your chemistries and your classes.
Thank you. We'll wait for the questions from the audience there.
One question. If we have many rings, the disease, many rings, how can we use some of the fungicides or any cultural practice to help?
Mini ring is a very difficult disease to control, and honestly, we're still learning quite a bit about it. Again, some of the preventative, I'd have to go back and I might need to give you my card, whoever gave me that, or point you towards Phil Harmon or Bruce Martin, who's done a little bit more of that research. I don't have a ton of experience with mini ring. I do know that I believe that nitrogen source has an impact on it, and I'd have to go look, and it's escaping me whether it's an ammonium or a nitrate-based source that's better. But mini ring is caused by a rhizoctonia, so a rhizoctonia type of fungus is normally going to be more impacted by a strobilurin, so azoxystrobin would be a good choice on a preventative scale. But mini ring is one of those, once you get it, it's very hard to come back, and the disease acts very quickly. So I give a talk with Jim Kearns, who I think has been here before, on soil-borne diseases, and he talks about mini ring, and unfortunately one of his statements is good luck. So that's not a great thing to come from the pathology side. So I will say that hopefully stay tuned, and we can get some more information on mini ring, because I know it's an issue, and I know that it happens very quickly, and the disease is severe, and unfortunately for anybody else other than a pathologist, it's very photogenic, which is never what you want to hear as a superintendent.
One more question. When we have the soil CEC quite low, could you please suggestion for low CEC on green?
So the question was your CEC is low on a green?
Yeah.
That's just part of having sand-based putting greens. They're inherently going to have low CEC, cation exchange capacity, because they don't have a lot of clay, and clay minerals are the primary source of cation exchange capacity in a soil. So don't worry that if you get a test report, if it says low, that might as well just say sand, because that's what it means. Sands just have low cation exchange capacity. Adding organic matter like peat additions or compost additions, and even the roots and the organic matter from the grass over time will decay, and then that can add cation exchange capacity to your soil. But if you have a new green, you're just always going to have low levels, and that's okay. And some of the problems that we find with, let's say, looking at soil testing and old interpretations for not sand putting greens, you know, you might see a potassium recommendation of 100 or 200 parts per million. It may be hard to ever get that high of a number in a sand because they don't have enough cation exchange capacity to hold on to that much potassium plus the other cations that's in that soil. So don't get too worried about that number, and just know that it's just typical of a sand to have low cation exchange capacity. If it is not a putting green and you want to increase cation exchange capacity, amending it with organic matter sources or even low levels of soil can help to increase that capacity.
Any other questions from the audience?
Lee, you mentioned this morning urea and the acidifying and alkali type of fertilizer materials. I've always understood that urea had a lime equivalency of 70 or 80. Ammonium sulfate's about 110, and urea I've always considered to be a slightly acidifying fertilizer, but this morning you indicated that it is not. So I'm a little confused. Can you clarify this?
Sure. We apply urea and we don't see any difference in pH before and after. On bulk soil pH.
I understand that, but on sandy grains or?
No, this is native soil.
Okay, well, I can understand that. Native soils have got a very significant pH buffer, but on sand, where you have a very low pH buffer, you can swing pH pretty quickly.
All right, so I want to talk a little bit about, why do these fertilizers change the pH? So the first reason that fertilizer changes pH, one of the ones we use the most, is ammonium sulfate. The first thing we have to know is it's not the sulfate, right? It's all the ammoniums. And so if you can think about what the ammoniums look like, it's a nitrogen surrounded by 4 hydrogen atoms. When it's being taken up or assimilated into the plant, or it's being reduced from ammonium to nitrate, which is what happens primarily and pretty rapidly, oxygen molecules are added to the nitrogen. So we're liberating hydrogen, and so that's where we're getting acidification effect. When it comes to urea, you have a molecule in which you have a carbon and an oxygen, and then you're going to have your 2 nitrogens on each side with 2 hydrogens attached to those nitrogens. And so you're going to get some formation of different acids as the urea is going to be broken down into the ammonium source, and it's going to release carbonic acid. So you're going to get some small levels of acidification during that carbonic acid formation during the hydrolysis of urea. But because of how, and that's where we're talking about, it's not going to be a huge amount, but there potentially would be some. The other part about that is, though, you're going to go from now a nitrogen source that's been liberated, and it's going to have 2 hydrogens on it. It's going to have to take hydrogen from the soil to then go to an ammonium or ammonia source of 3 or 4. So you're getting this kind of canceling out effects of the carbonic acid formation plus the acidity being used to form those higher forms of nitrogen.
So you're removing hydronium ion from the soil.
Exactly.
Okay.
And so you're reducing, and so even though you're getting an acidification from the one side, you're losing it again. But then again, everything's happening really dynamically, because then you're going to go, again, from an ammonium source, the microbes are going to denitrify or or not denitrified, they're going to bring it down to a nitrate force through nitrification. That's going to then refree those hydrogen ions and add the acidity back. So it's very complex. Same thing as the plant is utilizing it. There's a lot of chemistry and biochemistry that's in there, and kind of those statements about, is it acidifying or is it a not acidifying type of fertilizer?
I understand. And again, looking at the lime equivalency, it is insignificant, but it's not going to be impacting the pH of the soil to raise the pH.
No, exactly, and that's why I was saying.
It's a safe fertilizer if you're dealing with alkalinity.
And that's what I was saying with it going up before, it's probably because of the water or some other source that's driving it, and you don't have the acidification of a pure ammonium fertilizer going in there to cancel out and to kind of suppress that slow, gradual climb in pH.
And it's also the cheapest source of nitrogen.
Yeah, and it's very soluble, about 1-to-1 with water, so it's very nice.
Any other questions from the audience or speakers? Anything from the speakers to the audience?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
Give them a round of applause. Thank you, guys.
You can just yell it at me.
Okay, so the question was, with Primo Max, how often should we apply it? And again, this is really going to depend on your latitude and your average temperatures. So in the United States, when I gave that talk, I'm thinking about how the weather is changing a lot over the course of the year, where it's very cold, and then it's very warm, and then it cools off again. So because of that, the intervals in the United States change. As it gets colder, we have to apply it less frequently. Here, because your climate is much more consistent, we can actually figure out what our interval is and know that it probably doesn't change very frequently, or very much from across the year. So what would be your average daily air temperature in Celsius in Bangkok? About, yep, 28, okay. So if it's 28, what's the annual range? Okay. Okay, so we're between 25 and let's just say 30 for round, easy numbers, okay? So when it's cold and your temperatures for a period of time are 25, we subtract off the base temperature of that, which is 10, so we get 15, okay? If the interval then for Primo is 220 growing degree days, we divide the 220 by 15, which comes to be like 14. Does that seem about right? So you're looking at a 2-week interval when it's the coldest. If the temperature is 30 degrees, we subtract off that 10, now it's 20. And so that would then be 220 divided by 20 equals 11. So for you guys, you're not going to change very much. So if you're using Primo on an ultra dwarf green, you could probably stay on about a 2-week interval, and if you wanted to get a little bit more suppression, maybe go to a 10-day interval. Going to a weekly interval is going to lead to that accumulation effect that I talked about, because you're going to be applying it faster than it breaks down. So imagine your interval was supposed to be 2 weeks, and you're applying weekly. If you used a 4 mil rate when you applied, 4 mils per 100 square meters, if you use that rate and you applied it weekly, and it was only 25 degrees outside for a period of time, in your first app, you would have that 4 mils. And over the next week, only 2 of those mils would be removed or broken down. Then you'd put 4 more mils on. You're going to have 4 plus 2 it turns into 6 mils. A week after that, half of that would be gone. So now it's 3 mils. And then we're going to add 4 more. Now we're up to 7. And so by applying it more frequently, then the plant is breaking it down or being removed or mowed off. Then we start to see this accumulation effect. And again, the higher the rate, the more suppression we get. The harder we've pushed on that brake pedal to really shut down and reduce our clipping yield.
So I've got a follow-up question.
Oh,
You're giving consideration in this calculation to what a lot of people call the rebound effect?
So the rebound effect is something that we see in cool season grasses. And so what would happen would be if we apply the PGR and we reduced our clipping yield by 50%, once the PGR wears off, it actually increases by 50%. And so that's been really clearly observed on the cool season grasses and maybe on some of the other Bermuda grasses that are more common Bermudas. I think that's from the 90s research. Now, another testing of the last 2 years at 4 different universities in the Southeast on ultra dwarfs, they did Tiff Eagle, Tiff Way, and Champion. And none of them had a rebound. They all just wear off and go back to how fast they would have been growing if they had never treated with the PGR. So not as worried about the rebound effect. Interestingly too, even the bent grass greens that rebound at higher latitudes, they don't rebound when the temperatures outside are consistently having highs of about 30 degrees or greater. We see lower and lower rebound as a result of that. Thinking the plant's under so much stress that it's not producing much of that GA hormone, and so we don't see that buildup of damming the river analogy to cause that rebound once the product is worn off.
I was going to ask about the stress effect perhaps in the rainy season and what might occur if there's a lot of rain. Does that change that at all as far as the impact that the temperature is having?
That's a great question because I've been thinking about it since I've been here. If you have stress, and we talk about growth potential in terms of temperature, but if that's pretty consistent, not a huge reduction during the rainy season, but we have a massive reduction in light intensity, then potentially that plant isn't at the same potential to grow as it would have been during a dry season. And so that might be something that we need to think about and maybe adjust our intervals, because remember the 2 reasons the PGRs last longer when it's cold outside is because the temperature is important, but then the other reason that they last longer, or they can last as long as they do, is because of how often we're mowing them off. So if the clipping yields start to go way down because it's not sunny enough to support normal growth rate, my removal of Primo during mowing also is going to be shut down. So my interval then would become longer. And so if you're seeing like maybe I'm getting too much suppression, or you're monitoring your clipping yields and you're noticing that they are going lower and lower during that rainy season, maybe adjusting and lengthening your interval on your PGRs could make some sense. Would you guys have any thoughts on that kind of reasoning at all? It's hard to say, I mean, because no one is doing research like that in a subtropical or tropical climate. It's all being done in, the southeast part of the United States, which really is, has a very cold period in the winter and then a warm period, and, very different types of climate than what you guys have with the monsoon seasons.
I think in Japan particularly, and to some degree in Korea, what a lot of these superintendents will do is they'll start going on, they'll cut off nitrogen almost 100% just before the rainy season starts. Then they start making Primo applications on 2-week intervals, period. And what usually results is a growth of cyanobacteria on the surface of the greens. And I mean, I've just seen such disasters from the use of these products without really understanding what they're doing. And in Japan and Kyushu, maybe Andrew can comment on this, but we have what is called the what is it, the tropical night syndrome, where it is 30 degrees day and night, 24 hours a day with low light conditions.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. We're growing bentgrass at temperatures in Japan and Korea that are averaging higher at the same time of year than Manila, Singapore, and Thailand.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, I mean, I think your comment about nitrogen and Primo make a lot of sense. And again, that's where I'm to this point of, if that analogy again, if we're not growing grass and we're getting diseases like algae, and part of the reason is because our clipping yields are too low, you know, using lower rates of that PGR, but then increasing fertility rates. Again, I would still stay on the plant growth regulator, but just use low rates, because then you still get a lot of the other secondary benefits in terms of cell density, sugar reallocation, all those things. But then just enough to get those benefits, use your nitrogen to promote enough growth so that you can have the first surface that you need to have. I think that's an important thing to say. And monitoring clipping yield is going to be a good way to know that.
If we keep using the Primo in the long term, will it affect to the root system or not?
The question was, if you're using Primo for a long time, does it affect your root system, right? That's what I heard. It doesn't appear to be the case. There may have actually be some research for Bermuda grass from North Carolina, USA, that showed that it could have a positive benefit on the ultra dwarf or on Bermuda grass roots as long as we didn't have too much growth suppression. But when you start to see a lot of clipping yield suppression, we actually start to see some significant reductions in the rooting of the Bermuda grass. Not as much with the Primo as you would see with some of the other growth regulators, the things like Cutlass or Trimmet. But again, those are, it can, if you get too much suppression and you see too much visible phytotoxicity, if you see the yellowing, you are negatively impacting that rooting too. So if you're using it properly and you're not seeing a big reduction in the quality on the top, then you're probably not hurting the roots below and potentially maybe helping slightly.
Can we use Primo to help to reduce the flower of the turf?
Can you use Primo to help with seed heads and flowering? The research would say that these GA inhibiting products do not prevent the grass from flowering. Although one thing we can notice is that they can be delayed in their flowering, because that hormone gibberellin is important for those flowers to emerge. So when areas that aren't treated, depending on when the grass is flowering, you might look at that and see, I treated it with Primo, I don't see any flowers. Everything I did treat with Primo, I see flowers. But then if you wait a week or a month, you might start to then see those flowers start to come up. So, and I've seen this now on initially in cool season grasses, but now we're testing it on warm season grasses in Nebraska. One of the grasses we have there, it's a native, is called buffalo grass. It makes lots of seeds. And we see the same types of things with the buffalo grass, where the seed heads aren't actually inhibited, they just delay their emergence. Micah?
Thank you. I have a question for Bill, and I want to change to cool season grass.
Okay.
So growth Primo on bentgrass greens, kind of what Jim was talking about. In the Korea or Japan, it might be 6 weeks or 8 weeks where you have supra-optimal temperatures. And in Shanghai last year, there was a period of time when the high temperatures were like 41, 42, and the lows were 29. And in January in Sydney, in the western suburbs, there was one place where it got up to 47, and there their lows are going to get down to 22 or 19, but
Yep.
it's still like a super high temperature. So I just want, and I know I've asked you this by email a few times, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding. And so what I'm understanding, can I tell you, and then you correct me, please? So
Yes.
I'm understanding you're saying three things. One is basically continue the Primo application to obtain the plant health benefits. Number two, adjust the Primo rate to be a little bit lower so that we're getting some plant health benefits, but we're not suppressing the growth too much. Number three is track the clipping yield and see how low that drops, and if something bad happens either visually with the grass or with the clipping yield starting to just plummet, then we just sort of say, okay, let's stop using growth regulator. Is that all we know right now?
The first 2 points I would say 100% that I agree with. The third point, I'm unsure. So I'm not going to agree or disagree with you on that point. Because so your clipping yield's coming way down. In the past, I would have just said, if you're not growing grass, just stop applying the PGR. But when I do see some of our, field research, and in this year, we didn't have Sydney quite heat, but in Nebraska this year, we had temperatures of 42 for a high, and then our lows were, let's see, that would be about like 26, 27, so still pretty warm. And the areas that were treated with the PGRs had better quality than the areas that didn't have it. And that was only for a month. It wasn't for like 6 or maybe 3 weeks versus, they might have it for 6 or 8 weeks in Japan. But so I see those little bit of plant health benefits. I think there is a point, though, that when the grass is that hot, kind of looking at some of the modeling that we started doing in the growth chamber, where we were looking at how the grass would respond to fertilizer based on a kind of more short burst of temperature, maybe a couple weeks instead of a couple months. We'd see when we got to 35, you could put down some very, very high levels of fertilizer and not see that much clipping yield response. It's the same as when it's very cold and you not see that response. So I wouldn't recommend also, if you're in Japanese market or if you're in Sydney, and be like, yep, my clipping yield is low, I'm just gonna have to keep putting more and more and more nitrogen down. You have to just kind of realize, I'm in low gear. I can't get that clipping yield even if I had put down an outrageous amount of fertilizer. And so there's kind of that fine line when it comes to really trying to dial things in with clipping yields to make sure that you kind of realize with growth potential, where are you in terms of that? And if you're in a very suboptimal condition for cool season grass of being too hot or too cold, you may not be able to achieve your goals with just nitrogen fertilizer, and that might be fine. But I would probably still use a very, very low rate of the PGR just to further reduce some of the clipping yield and try to keep the carbon reallocation in a positive manner to help with that plant stress and the water retention.
Thank you.
This is what I said this 2 days ago, and I think it's something that we're really bad about in the turf industry. We just talk about growth, and people assume that means growth of the leaves and how much is in your bucket. But the prime example, in a cool season environment, again, sticking cool season, when the grass, say in Japan, starts to grow more vigorously as it's warming up and entering a more normal season, if we start over-fertilizing with nitrogen, we can get a huge increase in that gibberellin hormone and put a lot of resources to growing roots. And so our clipping yields might say we are growing a lot, But we also know that then we're sacrificing energy restores in the crowns and in the roots, so that when we have the real high stress of those Japan nights where the temperature hasn't really changed from the daytime, now you have less sugar because you've burned it off by the grass trying to grow rapidly. So we have to have a little bit of a little bit more discrete language when it comes to talking about growth. And so I try to say clipping yield, knowing that if I'm suppressing clipping yield, like with Primo, and even under normal conditions, the energy that would have gone to clippings we're seeing stored, and we're seeing wider leaves, and we're seeing more tillers, and those are all different forms of growth that maybe wouldn't be something that we would associate with just how much is in the bucket.
How long the chemical action of the fortified fungicides effective in the soil?
So this is, I'll just answer. The question was, how long do the fungicides last, and could you use a model for fungicide degradation? And I'll just answer quick, and I'll turn it over to Lee. I think that there's some potential there to maybe use some sort of modeling to predict how long other products last. I really think that can happen. But the problem is you can't just look at what's in the plant. It's easy for the plant growth regulators. If they're in the plant, they're inhibiting that pathway. So we can use plant growth to assess that. If you look at some research from a friend of ours, a professor at Wisconsin named Paul Koch, they were doing research to understand how long snow mold fungicides, things you put on grass as it's going dormant, last. And things that they're noticing through that work and through other different types of diseases they started looking at was even the best fungicides at the high rate might only be in that plant for 10 days or 2 weeks. But it's going to give you potentially almost a month of control against the pathogen. So potentially, at least in my thought, maybe this is where you can come in, is that the fungicide is having the more profound effect on the pathogen, and so is it staying in the pathogen, or is it setting back the biochemistry in the pathogen so far that it takes that pathogen a month to kind of fully recover from that one-time episodic, hit with the fungicide?
I think you said the same thing in a different way twice.
Okay.
So you're talking about the impact that it's having on the pathogen. So it's not only Paul Koch, but Rick Lattin from Purdue University has also done really great work. And basically, almost every fungicide that he applies and monitors, so he goes back and puts it through a mass spectrometer to actually look at the fungicide concentration. And he also does a bioassay. So what he does is he applies the fungicide, and then he takes samples back into his lab and inoculates after 1 day, 2 day, 3 day, 4 day. When he does that and puts a fresh pathogen back on top, within 7 days, you get disease. 7 days afterwards. So that means that effective fungicide concentration within the plant and within that system is gone. But it also means that fungicide that's been sprayed onto the pathogen is still having that limiting effect. And I would say that as far as a model that goes along with that, I mean, that would make all that modeling really null and void. Because basically he's done it with at least 6 or 7 different fungicides from different fungicide chemical classes. And basically everything says the same thing, that within 7 to 10 days, no matter what the chemistry, well, I should say that the contacts go quicker, the ones that are not systemic within the plant. But no matter what it is, within 7 days, they're gone. Now, they're lasting 21 to 28 days because of, like you said, the impact that they're having on the chemistry, on restricting the metabolism of that pathogen. So, particularly, we've got to realize that whatever we put down, we're harvesting it off, particularly on greens. We're continually removing fungicide and fungicide residue, and no matter what we do. So the reason that the ones are lasting longer is, A, they do get in the plant, but B, they also have more of an impact on that pathogen. And that's why we see the rate response. So if you put 1 ounce of, if we put one rate, a low rate, basically you're going to have 14 days worth of control, whereas if you put the high rate, you're going to have twice that amount of control, or 21 to 28 days of control.
I have a question for Andrew McDaniel. Andrew, you gave a presentation on Monday, and if I understood correctly, you said you only you spread sand top dressing on the greens in 2017 2 times. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And I think you didn't do coring or solid tine or anything.
Correct.
Are you worried something bad's going to happen?
Kind of, but because really I've only got maybe 1 time per year if I want to do an aerification or certain cultural practices that I only got 1 time per year that I can do that. So in that regards, yeah, it makes me a little bit nervous because I don't know what's going to happen, but I've gone 2 different years without aerifying, and I really haven't seen any negative effects by doing so. So I'm gradually getting more comfortable monitoring what's happening on the surface and maybe a little bit below the surface, and then I guess reacting to what I need to do after that. But I think every superintendent, if they didn't have to, they don't want to aerify, I would think, or do all these cultural practices because it's just more work and to do it, and then it's more work to afterwards. But I'm gradually feeling more comfortable. But yeah, at first I guess it makes you a little uneasy. But so far, I think we'll just monitor it, and I don't plan to aerify until I see maybe a problem arising. Did that answer your question?
Would you feel more comfortable, as comfortable if you were managing Bermuda grass as you do bent grass, though, in that way?
That's another good question. Yeah. Well, I've got zoysia grass, so yeah, bent grass in Japan, like Jim was saying, they go through a really, really tough time during the summertime. Yeah, maybe those guys don't have as much leeway to work with, because when it comes hard for the bent grass. But again, why are you aerifying is the question. Do you have too much organic matter, or are you just doing it because that's what we always do? I guess you need to figure out why you're aerifying before you start.
Yeah, because there's a course in Kumamoto that's bent greens that hasn't aerified for years, and I went to Kyushu Golf Club in September, right at the end of summer, and they haven't aerified for 13 years, and those greens are very high quality.
If you got problems, yeah, aerify. But if you don't have like some serious organic matter buildup, or I guess major drainage issues, or you need to change the soil, or I don't know. If you don't have any of those issues, then why are you aerifying?
I work with a professor that spent 15 years studying aeration, hollow tine, salad tine, water injection, top dressing, and bent grass, Bermuda grass greens across the United States and even outside the United States. And you hollow tine if you have layer issues, if you have an accumulation of thatch and mat that has issues with infiltration and water percolation. But if you're happy with your root zone, there's no reason that through just aggressive cultivation and even in continuing solid tining so that water is moving through the canopy, you can't have great putting greens. So always having the hollow tine, just the hollow tine doesn't make a lot of sense. It's more about making frequent holes so that water and gas can go in and out of that profile, and then you dilute that organic matter with with sand top dressing. And so as long as you're doing those certain things, what Rock would find is, and I'm sorry, this unit is weird enough, it would be a cubic yard, so it'd be like cubic meter. So if you were at about 0.7 cubic meters of sand per 100 square meters, like that would be a good level in most cases to suppress the thatch. But again, that's going to depend on length of season and aggressiveness of your fertilization. So just monitor to make sure you're continually diluting your thatch, and you're making holes. They can be solid tine, they can be with water, they can be with bayonet tines, they can be, just make a hole so that air can get up and in and water can get through that profile and through the top of that surface.
That converts to 6 millimeters.
6 millimeters.
Okay, this is the last question. We're running out of time here. This is probably for you, Andrew. They want to know how to achieve 10 and above in green speed and on zoysia grass.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's so many different types of zoysia grass out there, so I guess every different type would maybe have calls for a different management practice. What we do is it's hard to have that, I think. If you're looking for that particular week where you want to get the green speeds up over 10, close to 11, I think it's a little bit more easier. If you want to do that year round, then I think you might find it a little bit more of a struggle. But yeah, I think the main thing is just manage your growth rate, use your PGRs. I've found in our golf course that if we mow at 3 millimeters, and if we raise it up to like 3.2, it's amazing how much slower they get. So I think mowing, you're getting your mowing heights, as low as you can possibly get them without damaging the turf. If you're in a tropical environment, the zoysia grass is obviously thriving, so it's not going to negatively affect the turf, I don't think. So as long as you're not scalping or damaging the turf in any way, I think getting your mowing heights as low as possible. And yeah, managing the growth rate is the big thing. Get your rollers out there and increase your frequency of cut if you need to during those times you want to get the green speeds up.
Okay, guys, give them a round of applause. I'm sure if you have any more questions, please contact the speakers. I'm sure they're more than happy to help you guys out, okay?
Raise your hand, mini ring guy.
Okay, let's move on to the next stage. Let's have you guys stay up here for a little bit. They're gonna present you with some
ในโอกาสนี้ขอเรียน
souvenirs
เชิญ
before you guys go.
ท่านนายกสมาคมผู้ดูแลสนามกอล์ฟนะคะ ท่านมีของที่ระลึกให้กับทางสปีกเกอร์นะคะ ขอเซตเวทีแป๊บนึง
Stand up. Sorry. If you guys haven't got your USB yet, please get them right up front. On them, there are 3 presentations. That
Anybody needs my business card?
Yes.
I brought them today.
I got them too.
Yeah.
Grab us.
Just contact them, and they'll be happy to help you guys out. Okay. We'll go one at a time here. First up, go ahead, Andrew. Thank you. Okay, Dr. Lee Miller. bit. Okay, one more time for all three speakers, please. Thank you.
ขอเรียนเชิญกรรมการด้านหลังขึ้นมาด้านหน้าเลยนะคะ ขอมาถ่ายรูปร่วมกับสปิเกอร์ด้วยนะคะ กรรมการสมาคมทุกท่านเลยค่ะ ขอพิธีกรเข้าในเฟรมด้วยได้ไหมคะ ขอบคุณค่ะ
ขอบคุณมากครับ ขอบคุณมากครับ
ครับ สวัสดีครับ คณะผู้บริหารเจ้าหน้าที่การกีฬาแห่งประเทศไทย ท่านคณาจารย์ ท่านวิทยากร ผู้จัดงานและสมาชิกที่มาร่วมงานในวันนี้ กับผมและสมาคมผู้ดูแลสนามกอล์ฟไทย ขอพระคุณทุกท่านที่ได้ทำให้งานการจัดงานในวันนี้สำเร็จรุ่ร่วงไปด้วยดี การสัมมนาตลอดระยะเวลา 3 วันที่ผ่านมาก็หลายหน่วยงานได้มีโอกาสได้ร่วมกิจกรรมกัน ซึ่งเป็นการเสริมสร้างและการสร้างความสัมพันธ์ร่วมกัน อันจะทำไปสู่การประสานงานและความร่วมมือในการทำงานให้สำเร็จครั้งต่อไป ท้ายนี้ผมขออาราธนาคุณพระศรีรัตนตรัยและสิ่งศักดิ์สิทธิ์ในสากลจงดลบันดาลให้ทุกท่านประสบแต่ความสุขเจริญในหน้าที่การงานยิ่งขึ้นไป และขอให้ท่านเดินทางกลับโดยความสวัสดิภาพขอบคุณครับ
Okay, guys, that's about it for today. We'd like to thank all you guys for coming. We'll take a moment to thank all the sponsors, such as the RNA.
AGAF,
Of course, there are translators,
Sport Authority of Thailand,
this hotel, Dusit Thani Hotel,
and all supporters of our event.
and of course, all three speakers. Please give them a round of applause one more time.
One more time. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Hope you
Thank
guys
you.
make it to next year's conference.
For your questionnaire, our staff will collect from you. Please put down. Okay.
You guys have a great trip home. Hope you guys had a great stay in Pattaya, Thailand. Thank you very much.